All right, it is officially 5:30. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for sticking around. I know it is the last session of the day, and I basically stand between you and the party. So even though I probably shouldn't set the expectation that it'll be as popular, as entertaining as your DJ or what's coming next, but I'll try my best to make it as fun as possible and keep you guys awake through the entire session. To start off, my name is Nikhil Shampur. I am a software development lead on the ArcGIS Online and Enterprise team, product development team. And so today I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking to you about ArcGIS Enterprise on Microsoft Azure. So what I'd like to set the agenda for today is, give you guys an overview of ArcGIS Enterprise on Azure and what's our strategy on that platform and that environment. I'll go through the different deployment options, some of which is new at 10.6 and might interest folks in the room. We'll go through the what's new since 10.5.1 and 10.6. For many of you familiar faces from last year, this might interest you in terms of what's new. And then the big piece that I want to spend a lot of time on at this conference, a developer conference, is time on automation. Because as the saying goes, if you're not automating, you're probably not doing it right. And then to really get some value out of this session, I'll spend some time talking about tips and tricks and gotchas that you should keep in mind. And then we'll discuss some of the roadmap and planned work for the 10.6.1 release and 10.7 for 2018. I usually like to do a quick survey so I can get a sense of the audience. If I may ask a quick raise of hands, the first question is pretty vague in terms of most of you wear multiple hats, but if I were to get a sense of anybody in the room who's like pure developer, not responsible for infrastructure, few hands. IT administrators, and happen to be responsible for ArcGIS, more hands. How about GIS administrators who have to do both IT and I'm guessing the rest are managers who have a few of them. All right, cool. Basically, my question really boils down to the second one. How many of you are directly responsible for the management, that is the install, upgrade of your ArcGIS workloads like Enterprise? Almost everybody in the room. It kind of explains why you're here, but asking the obvious. This one's more interesting. How many of you are already using the cloud? Good portion, 70, 80%. How many of you are planning to in the next 6 months kickstart stuff? The remaining 20%. And then long-term plans, don't know yet. A few hands. That's good. How many of you have already used our Cloud Builder tooling before? Roughly 30, 35%. Okay, that's good to know. So I guess I'll spend some time then, giving a more depth overview, since for many of you it appears that this tooling is new ground. So I'll spend some time talking about the overview. So this is a mission statement I basically made up, which says that the ArcGIS Enterprise team, their mission is making deploying and managing ArcGIS Enterprise on Azure as seamless as possible. So what does that mean? What's our strategy towards achieving that? So how do we intend to achieve that? It's sort of a two-pronged strategy. The first one is we provide you these virtual machine images that are available in the Azure Marketplace, both in commercial or public Azure, in whatever 36 regions generally available and 6 regions in preview, and also in the US GovCloud, codename Fairfax. So this really takes care of the software acquisition and the software installation process. So we make these images ready for you and optimized for your use. And then the second strategy is we provide, to make it easy for you to deploy your sites and instances and manage them. So we provide these deployment tools, and the first one is Cloud Builder, which some of you might be familiar with, and that I'll go into in a minute. And what's new at the latest release of ArcGIS Enterprise is support for automation. So why is this a big deal? Why am I making such a big deal out of this strategy? If you think about Azure and the infrastructure as a service, there's a lot of concepts involved today. There's things like resource groups, load balancers, traffic rules, network security groups, virtual networking concepts around those like subnets and cedar blocks, and etc. And then there's IT-related things like the Windows firewall, installing SSL certificates, and you need to know what are availability sets, availability zones, and scale sets. So there's a lot to learn there, and there's a lot of terminology and nomenclature. For some of you already familiar with the Azure environment, this is second nature, but for others getting started, it can be a little intimidating at start. So that's where Cloud Builder steps in. So what is Cloud Builder? The elevator pitch for it, it's a desktop application for Windows. It provides a wizard-driven experience for you to achieve your deployment and your post-deployment workflows. It also provides some neat integration with Azure native features. Examples of those are, platform as a service features like Azure Managed Databases, SQL Database, Postgres, etc. Secure storage of keys and certificates through Azure Key Vault, and then object store systems like blob storage and table storage. And then as ArcGIS Enterprise evolves and starts to understand native cloud environments and native cloud storage like HDFS and Azure Data Lake, these sort of experiences will light up inside of Cloud Builder. Similarly with Azure Active Directory, the ability to configure enterprise logins with Azure Active Directory. That's a feature that's being worked on. So really Cloud Builder gives you this integration where it's an easy to use experience. You would use it without having to know a whole lot about Azure. I'd like to spend a brief moment and talk about site deployments because that does set the stage for the demo and in trying to understand the capabilities of Cloud Builder. For those of you familiar with the evolution of ArcGIS Server into ArcGIS Enterprise and your GIS servers and WebGIS, some of these concepts might be familiar to you, but I'll just reiterate them. At the center of it all really is your base deployment, which has your portal for ArcGIS and your hosting server. And the hosting server essentially consists of an ArcGIS server buddied with the ArcGIS data store. And then the tier on the middle tier basically consists of all of your different, what we call the role-based servers. These could be generic ArcGIS servers that are federated with your portal. They could be things like a specialized server for serving imagery, your image server. Could be GeoEvent or GeoAnalytics. So you get the idea. At the bottom tier is all of the different data stores that you could have as part of your ArcGIS Enterprise site. So there is the relational data store, there's the tilecast data store, there's the spatiotemporal big data store, there's also inputs in the form of like big data file shares and big data catalog services, and then there's the more generic data stores as well, like traditional relational databases. In terms of Cloud Builder, you have the option to deploy these sites or these different servers either as a single machine or all-in-one configuration, or you could decide to split the workload out into multiple machines. Actually in the single machine, or you could have a cluster of these machines, multiple servers essentially. Alternatively, you can choose to put all of these different components, portal, server, data store, etc., on a single tier or single machine, or you can choose to split them into multiple tiers or different machines. So Cloud Builder gives you the flexibility. So you can split your workloads into different tiers, and each of those tiers can have one machine or multiple machines, and you can scale according to your workload needs. And then in terms of actual storage options, you're already familiar that to set up ArcGIS Enterprise, you typically need a shared file system if you're doing multiple machines. Typically that's a network file share or a SAN device on premises. In the cloud, you have additional storage options. Cloud Builder provides these three options. One is to use a regular file share machine to store the server's configuration store and the server's and the portal's content store. I'll go through another slide in terms of discussing which options to use when. So there's the file share option. There's also the option to use Azure blobs and tables. And then the third one, which is Azure Files, which provides SMB as a service, is new at 10.6. And in a subsequent slide, I'll explain the pros and cons and when to use what and considerations there. In terms of getting started, how does that work? Essentially, it's a really simple step. The first one is, obviously, you want to get an Azure subscription. Go to azure.com, sign up for a trial, sign up for, if your enterprise already has Azure as part of an EA, you've already got it, that's good. The next one is you actually need to get your ArcGIS Enterprise software licenses. And this you'll do through your regular means, going through your My Esri site, downloading those licenses locally to your machine. And then the third is actually you'll get the ArcGIS Enterprise Cloud Builder. With that, I'll do a quick demo describing how you get started and where you'd actually find Cloud Builder. So what you're looking at is our documentation page for ArcGIS Enterprise. If you do a quick search for ArcGIS Enterprise on Azure, the first link in Google should take you to this. So here you'll find instructions on getting started. Installing Cloud Builder. Cloud Builder, by the way, is a free tool. You can download it off of the My Esri site. It's a really quick install. It uses Click One technology, and within moments to a minute, you should have Cloud Builder up and running. Alternatively, you can find in the Azure Marketplace with all our image listings, you can find links to the Cloud Builder from here as well. So that's how you can acquire Cloud Builder. And then obviously the last option is My Esri. So with that, I've launched the ArcGIS Cloud Builder 10.6, and I'm going to go ahead and sign in at this point. It's going to bring up a sign in dialog where I'm going to sign into and you'll have to bear with me for a moment while I do my two-factor. Oh, actually, I just did it on this device, so I did remember that. It's going to show me a list of all my Azure subscriptions. I'll pick the one that I want to work with for this demo or for this session. And what you see here is a catalog list of all of the different sites that I've previously provisioned or a colleague of mine has provisioned. So you have the ability to deploy new sites and manage existing ones. And I'll call out that new at 10.6 is the ability to also deploy ArcGIS Desktop on Azure as well. So for the sake of this demo, I'll start off with ArcGIS Enterprise. When I say deploy a new site, it's going to ask you what kind of site would you like to deploy? What's its purpose? Do you want to deploy a base deployment, which, as I mentioned, consists of those three primary components, your portal, the ArcGIS server, and the ArcGIS data store? That's your base deployment. Alternatively, you can pick one of the role-based servers like GeoEvent, GeoAnalytics, Image Server, or you could do a general-purpose GIS server. Imagine you were just standing up a service to geocoding. That's when you would pick one of the general-purpose server. Let's walk through the deployment for an ArcGIS Enterprise base deployment, and then I'll show you the differences between the other ones as well. So it's going to walk you through these different steps. The first, and ask you for a bunch of questions and provide you an interface for providing that information. The first one is the resource group into which you want Cloud Builder to provision these resources. Think of a resource group as a folder. That's probably the easiest way to start thinking about it. There's additional features to it, but that's a good way to sort of envision things. The next piece of information it's going to ask you is a unique domain name for your site. In this case, I'm going to say Dev Summit Demo. Excuse me. Sorry about that, folks. Thanks for understanding. So once I've provided a unique domain name, I'm ready to proceed on this screen. The next question is going to be the really important screen where it's going to ask you for license files that I've previously downloaded. So I browse out to my portal license file, my server license file. The next set of questions are going to be centered around credentials. So now I'm providing credentials for the primary site administrator and also for the ArcGIS service account. So this would be the account that ArcGIS runs as, the Windows service that runs ArcGIS. The next screen is going to provide information about the machine administrator, the virtual machine administrator. And in this case, since I chose to deploy a single machine site, I have the option to choose the size of machine and make changes to it. I can pick any machine within the region that I'm selecting. And so as Azure adds more machine sizes, they automatically show up here. So depending on my license type and what I have access to and my budget, I can choose an appropriate machine size. I can choose to size the operating system disk to what I would like. Optionally, you can even add a data disk and choose the type of data disk. We support solid state drives or premium storage and regular magnetic disk drives as well. And then I can set things like the time zone for that server to run as, give the machine a name. You can decide whether you want to enable Windows operating system updates and whether I'd like to access that machine through remote desktop. The next option is to specify the virtual network into which I'd like to place these machines in so they can talk to each other. So Cloud Builder gives you the ability to create these components within it or reference existing ones. Once I've chosen that virtual network, I click Next. The next screen is asking me for the type of, since this is a base deployment with a hosting server, what type of ArcGIS data stores would I like to enable? By default, you have the relational, which is enabled and checked. You can choose to enable tile caches and spatiotemporal as well. The next screen is going to ask you a Cloud Builder specific question in terms of where do I put these deployment artifacts? And I'll go into depth about deployment artifacts in a short while, but basically it is required for Cloud Builder to function. All it needs is a storage account into which it will use for the deployment. Then I talked about the different storage options for the configuration store and the content store. By default, it will place those files on the virtual machine. Alternatively, you can use Azure Cloud Storage to store those artifacts. And with that, you can choose Azure Files or Azure Blobs and Tables. And you would specify the storage account. You can create a new storage account right within Cloud Builder as well. The next option is asking you for an SSL certificate to install on the web servers. By default, Cloud Builder can provision one for you and automatically generate it. Or if you have a certificate issued by a trusted certificate authority, you'd export that as a PFX file and you'd browse out to it and provide it. Alternatively, if your company or organization has set up integration with Key Vault, and that's where your certificate is stored, you can browse out to Key Vault and pick the certificate from there as well. For the sake of this demo, I'll just pick the self-signed certificate option. This is a great option for dev test or staging environments. Very handy to use. At this point, it's going to show you a summary screen where you can review the parameters. You can save a summary, which saves it as clear text for later reference. Also useful when you're contacting support in a failure scenario. So very useful there. At this point, if I click Finish, what it's going to go off and do is going to provision all those resources, configure the ArcGIS component, and then depending on the size of the deployment and the machines that you picked, it's going to take anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour and a half to provision all of those, and you'll have a working functional deployment at that point. So as opposed to watching me do that, I'm going to walk through some of the other deployment scenarios in the meantime. In this case, let's imagine that I want to deploy, I've already deployed my base. Now I'm just going to add an image server to the mix. So everything remains the same in terms of questions. We ask you for a unique domain name through which you will access that site. The only difference you will see is in terms of the license files. In this case, since we're only deploying an image server, I would browse out to the license file for my image server. Everything else remains the same. Cloud Builder remembers all of your information. This screen is different when you're deploying a GIS server. It's basically asking you for security options to configure federation with the base deployment. You can choose to deploy the site as standalone and not federated, or you can choose an existing base deployment, provide the portal site administrator credentials, and have the site automatically federated at the end of deployment. Since this is an image server, you can choose to tag that server as your raster analysis server. Within Cloud Builder, you can browse out to Azure Blob Storage to select additional raster data stores to register as well. So that is along the lines of the cloud native features that I just mentioned, where in this case, we were actually using Azure Blob containers as raster data stores, and it's the output of raster analysis. Everything else remains the same options. I provide machine administrator, size of the machine, storage options, SSL certificate, summary page. So what I walked through was essentially deploying single machines of those. The only difference if I wanted to actually scale this out, I didn't want a single machine. I wanted more redundancy, or I wanted more capabilities, or more capacity, sorry. I'd uncheck the single machine deployment. And then the only change you will see at this point is in addition to the previous information, we're going to ask you for machine names and the sizes for those machines. By default, Cloud Builder can assign a set of machine names and sizes, or you can actually specify them. You can have unique control over that. If I choose to specify, the next screen is going to ask me for that information, and I'm going to choose how many machines I'd like. I can choose the size to use for those machines, and I can change the names to reflect what I would like to use. So that basically walks through how you do a multi-machine deployment. So as opposed to you watching me spin off a deployment, you can actually go to one of these sites, and it will open up a pre-deployed site that I built as part of this demo. So here's a geoanalytics server, which has been federated with my base deployment. So when I sign in, I'm redirected to my portal, and I can sign in. And it's federated and established, if you will. So the normal case. So with that, I'll switch back to some slides, and we'll come back for some more demos, because I believe I'm running behind. All right, so just wanted to give you some highlights between what's new at 10.5.1 and 10.6 for those of you who have used the tooling in the past or attended my presentations in years past. So at 10.5.1, what we added is we added support for Windows Server 2016. So our virtual machine images are based on 2016. And the team also tries to do a reasonably good effort in keeping up with patches and critical security patches that we've had in the past year. So we actually build on Windows Server 2016. We support Azure Blob Storage for portal content and for the geoanalytics big data file share. That was new at 10.5.1. In terms of Azure native features, we integrate with Azure Key Vault, as you saw. We switched to using managed disks. That was a huge change and an extremely valuable change for those who've worked in the pre-managed disk era. It's definitely a big change. What was also new is the virtual machine size picker. So as you know, there are new virtual machines coming out from Azure literally every week. The set of regions in which these machines are available are often variable. So we switched Cloud Builder around to be basically dynamic, to be able to pick machine sizes based on the region to which you are deploying to. And then we had some post-deployment workflows that were added in Cloud Builder, which is the ability to add and remove machines from the site. So if I deployed with a 2-machine site, I could come back in later and add a 3rd machine and shrink it likewise. We also added some start-stop functionality, which is useful if you have a site that's not used for critical use. You can actually turn those machines off and save money that way. And then you could actually resize machines right within Cloud Builder as well. So this was functionality we delivered at 10.5.1. At 10.6 is probably something that's more exciting and something that this audience will really appreciate, is we added support for automation. And by that, we support the ability to deploy or generate automation artifacts for Visual Studio, for PowerShell, and for the Azure CLI or command line interface. With that, it actually opens up the ability to deploy ArcGIS Enterprise and Azure from both Linux, Mac, and Windows, and from many other systems as well. We provide now a separate image for ArcGIS Desktop, which includes Desktop, Pro, and the License Manager. So you can spin those up using Cloud Builder or from the Azure portal. This was a common ask for customers, the ability to domain join your virtual machine. Most large Windows shops, as they move to Azure, often run their own domain controllers or have Active Directory domain services. So right within Cloud Builder, you can actually specify the domain join information, and when those machines provision, they will join the machine as needed. We added support for Azure Files, which is a managed SMB service. And then one change that was requested by customers to be consistent with other deployments is we actually use the non-default context of server and portal for your base deployment. Earlier, it used to be the default ArcGIS. So I want to spend some time talking about automation because I think this has the most value for this audience. So a really quick recap of Cloud Builder provides you this wizard-driven experience. You can achieve your deployment workflows. What's new at 10.6 is Cloud Builder now also essentially becomes a designer to generate these automation artifacts. So on the summary page, you might have already seen it, but there was a button which said Save Automation Artifacts. So what it does is, when you click it, it brings up this dialog which asks you for, what kind of, what's your target environment for these deployment artifacts. And then based on all of that information that you provided in the wizard and those steps, it's actually going to generate those automation artifacts and the parameters necessary for you to be able to deploy in those environments. In terms of what it actually generates, these are the artifacts. It generates what's known as an Azure Resource Manager template. An Azure Resource Manager template is a declarative template which describes how my infrastructure or application should look like. It pre-populates all of the template parameters that you provided during Cloud Builder's wizard. It provides the automation artifacts for in-VM configuration. Excuse me. It also includes the license files that you provided as part of Cloud Builder. It also provides the SSL certificate that you provided as part of Cloud Builder, either the self-signed version or the CA certificate version. So those are all the deployment artifacts that it generates or gathers together. With that said, when would you choose one over the other? So you'd use Cloud Builder, if you were to look at it as a spectrum with power and simplicity on either sides, you'd use Cloud Builder for its simplicity. It's a wizard-driven experience, will meet 80-90% of your workflows. But if you really need to customize or extend the deployment, that's when you would use one of these other options. Like typical customizations and extensibility that we envision people using and people have asked for is, the first one is resource naming convention. So Cloud Builder has a set of hard-coded names that it assigns to load balancers and disks and network interfaces. If you don't like it, you can actually take those artifacts, tweak it, and customize it to your needs. Another ask is people actually want to split up their deployment and have them in separate subnets. You typically might have sort of a DMZ versus inside-outside network layout. Cloud Builder only lets you specify one subnet due to UI restrictions. But with the ARM template, you can actually go in there and explicitly specify the different subnets. And people might want to configure network security groups as part of their deployment. Cloud Builder doesn't create one. It works with existing ones. And oftentimes, as your enterprise grows and your need to integrate with your other infrastructure comes into play, you'll want to integrate with some kind of monitoring solution. So here's an example is, I would like the OMS agent installed using the OMS monitoring extension. Extremely easy to add within the ARM template. I want to configure alerts for my operations group to know if my site is working as expected. You can configure virtual machine backups all through the ARM template and extending that. You can configure things like schedule maintenance, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. So those are typical schedule maintenance. One thing I'd like to call out though, once you save the automation artifacts from Cloud Builder and you start editing it and tweaking it, at that point the training wheels are off. So we kind of expect you to know what you're doing at that point. So at that point, you're probably more of an advanced or power user of Azure. But just did want to call out that you are operating outside of Cloud Builder's comfort zone. And once you talk about getting into the world of automation, that really opens up the options of integrating with other infrastructure and CI/CD pipelines. Once you have these automation artifacts, you can wire them together with common deployment pipelines like Jenkins, Ansible, AppViewer, or integrated with Chef and Puppet or Travis CI. So it really opens that up. In addition, you can integrate it with both Azure Automation, and you can even do something neat, and I'll do a demo of this in a little bit, is you can actually deploy this all within, say, Cloud Shell, which is, for those of you not familiar, the Azure Cloud Shell is a completely browser-based or web-based interface, which provides you with the command line interfaces for Bash and PowerShell to run those commands right within your browser or even your mobile device. With that, I'll switch to a demo of automation. I should have actually gone through this. I I shouldn't have canceled out of that site deployment, but I'll be quick, hopefully, and walk through this entire thing. Bear with me while I type. It should be it. While I'm on the screen, I'll just highlight the database options that we provide as part of registering, as part of the Cloud Builder experience when deploying a general purpose site. So we've always supported Microsoft Azure SQL database, Microsoft SQL Server on a VM, or you can choose to deploy without a database as well. And right within Cloud Builder, you can provision those resources right within here, your database administrator credentials, database users, SDE users, all within Cloud Builder. If you're using SQL Server, you can choose which version of SQL Server to use, and also the size of the machine that you'd like to allocate. I'll choose none for this demo. And then, so this is the screen I talked about. So on the summary page, you're presented with this workflow to save your automation artifacts. And I click Browse, I can save out this, provide a file name, and click Generate. And what's going to happen is it's actually just going to generate the necessary automation artifacts on disk. It's going to copy over the license file. And in this case, the reason it's taking longer is because I chose a self-signed certificate option. And so Cloud Builder is actually generating that for me. Once it's done, it provides a confirmation message. I can go into that and save my, can't remember where I saved it now. Should be here. All right, good deal. So I can go in and extract it here. It should pop it up. So as I mentioned, the deployment, since in my workflow I actually chose all the 3 deployment options, it saved out the artifacts for each one of those. I chose Visual Studio, so it creates a Visual Studio solution file for me and a deployment project. Since I chose PowerShell as well, there's an entry-level script for PowerShell. Similarly, since I chose the CLI, there's the shell script that I can run in a bash window as well. I'm going to open up one of those automation artifacts in Visual Studio that I previously had loaded up. Visual Studio takes forever on my machine, so in the interest of time, I saved that up. So you'll notice that what it has today, Visual Studio has an experience and an IDE experience for deploying Azure Resource Manager templates. And so what you would need on your machine is the Azure Resource Manager template tooling that's part of Visual Studio. And as you can see, here's the ARM template. You have the design surface right within here, or the JSON view. Or if you're more of a UI person, you can come in and make edits through their wizards and their experience right within Visual Studio. For instance, if I wanted to add the OMS extension, I believe this version doesn't have the OMS extension for Windows, but yeah, so you get the idea. You can use the design time within Visual Studio to tweak this template, or you can go in and add resources by editing the JSON. In this scenario, what I was deploying was just a GIS server with optional resources for the SQL Server resources, so you saw that. And all of those parameters that I provided through Cloud Builder have now been saved in this parameters file. So I can easily go in and say deploy right within Visual Studio. It's going to have signed me into it's recognized that I'm already signed into Azure on the subscription. It has the parameters that got saved out. I can choose to edit those here. And then similar to Cloud Builder, it will ask you for an artifact storage account. So basically what happens is Visual Studio or PowerShell or Cloud Builder, what it does is these deployment artifacts, like your server license file, the DSC automation artifacts, it uploads it to this automation artifact, this artifact storage account file, and then it triggers the deployment. And I'll go into more depth on that. And then at this point, I can click deploy right within Visual Studio, and it will go off and spin those resources and create that site for you. So that was through Visual Studio. Through PowerShell, it would be a similar experience in that you would run the deploy ArcGIS site as your entry point, which basically calls into the same PowerShell resources that Visual Studio does. So we basically built around the Visual Studio template and the PowerShell tooling that comes as part of it. If you were doing shell at a bash script, you just deploy the ArcGIS site shell script. So with that quick overview of automation, I think real value for you guys is trying to understand how Cloud Builder works and being able to troubleshoot those and extend it as well. So under the hood, here's what Cloud Builder is responsible for. It has two responsibilities. One is to provision your infrastructure resources, and it does this using the Azure Resource Manager or ARM API. In previous releases, it did this through imperative code, where it would make API calls to provision load balancers and disks and machines. At 10.6, it does this through the declarative ARM template. Basically provides that ARM template and says, hey, Azure, please provision all of the resources that I've declared as part of this template. And then the next step it does is it triggers the in-VM configuration of the ArcGIS components. Sure, my machines came up. They started off with the marketplace images. The software was installed. But hey, I actually need to go ahead and license it, do the create site, install certificates. So all of that happens through PowerShell desired state configuration and automation through that. In previous releases, it used a custom script extension to trigger that DSE execution. At 10.6, it is a pure 100% DSE extension or desired state configuration based approach. So let's walk through the phase one or step one, where it provisions these infrastructure resources, as I mentioned. It'll provision virtual machines, availability sets, load balancers, virtual networks, etc. And for virtual machines, it'll provision its associated disks, network interfaces, all of that. And then this is the step I mentioned, where in Cloud Builder, it asks you for a deployment artifacts storage account. And what it does is at this point, it actually uploads these artifacts like your SSL certificate, the automation code, your license to a container within your Azure deployment artifact storage account. And then it triggers the deployment of the ARM template. So if you were doing it through CLI, it essentially executes this command on an Azure resource group and say, hey, create this deployment with this name in this resource group. Here's my template file. Here's my parameters file. In PowerShell, this translates to the new Azure RM resource group deployment commandlet, which again takes the name of a deployment, a resource group name, the template file, and the template parameters. So you get the idea. There's basically an ARM template, there's the parameters file, and there's some supporting artifacts. So no matter which automation option you use, the first thing it's going to do is actually going to stage those artifacts in that storage account, and then it's going to call this one single command that's going to go off, provision resources, start the in-VM configuration, and at the end of it, you have a working site. So some tips and tricks for people, as you're looking to customize, extend, troubleshoot these deployments. In addition, at the start I mentioned that I talk about the different storage options and how to help choose between those. So have some characteristics or options that you need to consider when evaluating one versus the other, because there's pros and cons to each, and there's trade-offs that need to be made. So on the left, I have a set of properties like latency, performance, and scalability, and on the right, I have your different options. So let's go through the file share virtual machine first. In terms of latency, it has the best or the lowest latency, I should say. With cloud storage like object stores like Blob or Azure Files, because these are managed services, often latency and performances can be variable. So you got to take that into account. In terms of performance, today Azure Files is built on standard disks and so is limited by the amount of performance it can deliver. Azure Files based on premium storage is being worked on. At that point, it'll probably be a better consideration. In terms of scalability, either FileShare VM will scale to as big as the managed disk that you provision. So it really has good scalability there. Azure Blobs, because it's a partition model, has really large scalability. Azure files, as I mentioned, because a single Azure file is a single partition within Azure storage. It is today limited to 1,000 IOPS per second, which meets a lot of workloads, but depending on your use case, may not be the best option. In terms of what you can actually store on these options, the ArcGIS Server Config Store and the Portal Content Store, you can store them on the file share or the Azure Blob or Azure Files. All three of them support the config and content store. If you're doing server directories, as you know, a lot of ArcGIS relies on file shares. If your server directories can only be hosted on a file share today, you cannot have them in Azure Blobs. Actually, you can have them in Azure Files as well. I apologize. That's a mistake on my part. You can actually have server directories in Azure Files as well. So the caveat with Files Share VM is high availability. Because it is a single machine, you have to take into consideration that it is a single point of failure. But I like to caveat that by saying that Microsoft provides a single machine SLA of 3 nines or 99.9 SLAs for even single machine VMs that are not in an availability set. If you buddy that with schedule maintenance, which is Azure allows you to schedule updates of those VMs, and so you have more control over when that file share might be taken offline for maintenance within the data center. So if you couple those two together, you get a really high SLA that meets most people's needs. So unless you have a 5.9 SLA that you need to meet, you probably can use file shares as well. So Azure Blobs and Files, they do have higher SLAs, but keep in mind some of the limitations that are there today. For Azure Blobs, you can't use the server directories. That still needs to be on a file share. For Azure Files, there is today a limit on throughput. So really, it's a trade-off between throughput and high availability. So depending on your needs, you'll have to choose one or the other. Okay, the next tip is troubleshooting deployment failures. All right, that's great. I used Cloud Builder or Visual Studio or Command Line. It started off this ARM template, and then an hour later, I got a failure. How do I start troubleshooting that? Well, the first thing is you actually want to examine the deployment within the Azure portal. So each deployment is stored as a record within the resource group. So you can browse to that deployment and you can get details about why it actually failed. So in this case, it complained, if you look at the right, it says that the VM extension, the custom script extension took too long and timed out. It's probably because the machine that I chose to execute on was very small and really timed out. So maybe I'd retry on a larger instance maybe. And then you want to examine, if you're deploying through Cloud Builder, it actually generates log files both on the Cloud Builder side and also on the remote machines as well, and then aggregates those. So you want to examine those and look for errors. Another common thing that we've seen failures from customers is when they don't use strong passwords for their Windows credentials for the ArcGIS service account. Windows Server credentials is always a moving target. If you happen to be deploying into, say, a domain controller with a stronger group policy, you want to make sure that the passwords that you provide meet those requirements. Otherwise, DSC throws a really non-helpful error message at this stage. And then another thing is, try and scale down. Try the defaults first. Start with small deployments, and then use the freedom of the cloud and redeploy and try and see, what's the smallest common deployment that works successfully for me. And if all of those fail, please support a tech support incident. They will likely ask you for your log files and the deployment summary, so they can reproduce that and report that back to the dev team. In terms of what's coming next or planned features, I'll do a quick overview of things. What we're working on actively for 10.6.1 is upgrades. And so this is huge. And so this is in-place upgrades for your standalone GIS servers and your WebGIS, which consists of your base deployment and your federated servers. And I know I'm running short on time, but I'll try and squeeze a demo for that. Another thing we're targeting is Azure Database for Postgres SQL. Today we support Azure SQL Database, which is essentially SQL Server or SQL Azure. So we are adding support for Azure Database for Postgres for those who like that flavor. We will support configuring enterprise logins using Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a very popular identity provider, supports SAML. works with Portal for ArcGIS as an identity provider. So we want to provide the experience within Cloud Builder where you can easily set that up. In terms of 10.7, when we talk about upgrades, an essential feature is the ability to back up and restore your VMs. So we plan to use the Azure Recovery Services Vault to actually store these VM level backups. Some of the backup level features might even make it to 10.6.1, but restore is definitely a 10.7 project. And then we also plan to provide what is known as solution templates within the Microsoft world, and that is the ability to actually deploy right within the Azure portal, where in addition to the ARM template, you can actually have a user, you can define a user experience and actually wrap the experience for generating parameters for the ARM templates. And then we are actively in the process of publishing our ARM templates on GitHub. And I'd like to take this opportunity and do a demo. A quick disclaimer, all of this is obviously subject to change. This is future releases, so don't hold my feet to the fire on that. I'd like to take a moment and do a sneak peek of some of those features because the team is actively at work on that. In terms of upgrades, 10.6.1. Or let me come to upgrades in a little bit. Let's do the resource manager templates. So what we're looking at is actually my private GitHub repo for these ArcGIS ARM templates. We will publish this at the Esri channel shortly once QA and everything's done. So this provides the ability for you to not even have to install Cloud Builder. You can actually start right by browsing to this GitHub page, click deploy to Azure, and it's going to bounce you into this experience, which is going to ask you for all those parameters that the ARM template needs. So if you're a power user and an advanced user and you know what you're doing, or you've actually saved out these parameters previously, you can actually go in and provide those and deploy right within Cloud Builder as well. Another option you could do is use Cloud Shell, right? And I mentioned that at the start. Oops, not that button. So this is actually Cloud Shell running right within my browser. It takes a few seconds to start up. And basically, I have a terminal, in this case, a bash window. I can choose to switch to PowerShell as well. And now with our automation artifacts, so I have the templates here. So here's the templates. We have all of the site topologies that I mentioned, your base deployment, single and multi-tier. You have the GIS server, single and multi-tier. You have desktop. And then we also publish the automation artifacts, the zip files. We also have sample parameters files that we will provide. So you can go in and just fill in the to-dos with the necessary information, and you're all set. And then for testing purposes, we also provide some self-signed certificates that are issued for the wildcards for a particular Azure domain, or a particular Azure region, I should say. These are just good for dev test, use something to be up and running. So with all of that publicly available through GitHub, so what I could do is I could come in and quickly download that template. CD or demo, and then I can download that template. It's like I have perhaps I copy pasted something wrong, but let me grab that real quick. Templates here. Download that, and then let me get the parameters file as well. Oops, sorry. Here, sample parameters. It's wrong. Let's do that. So at this point, I've got the templates. I've got the template parameters file. I can go in and edit the file and fill out my to-dos. I'm actually going to switch to another folder where I've got this pre-populated so you don't see me making errors and typos. I can go in and edit this right within Cloud Shell. And then the next step I need to do is the automation artifacts. I actually need to upload those to a staging location where my Cloud template can use it. So in this case, I've created a blob store or a container called deployment artifacts. I've uploaded my DSC file, the automation artifacts, my licenses, and the self-signed certificates. So at this point, I can actually go ahead and deploy. And it's supposed to watch me make a typo. Actually, let me show you the file which I've pre-populated with those parameters. So I filled out my to-dos, and then the key pieces of information are I put in where are my artifacts stored. In this case, I'm storing them in this location. Let me see if I can find you guys a URL here. Okay, doesn't seem to show that. But yeah, this is the URL to that blob or that blob container. And that's what I provided as my artifacts location. In this case, I made it a public blob container, but I could as well added a SAS token to access that container. So a SAS token is basically a short-lived or a shared access signature token that you can generate to provide access to that container so it remains private. So at this point, I have my parameters file. I'm going to quickly create a resource group. Okay, I'm going to create this resource group in East US. And I'm going to start off the deployment just based on some shell history, if I can find it. So I'm going to basically invoke that command that I mentioned. I'm going to create that deployment in this resource group. I'm going to give it this template parameters file, the template file and the template parameters file, and hit go. And then you should see this resource group that I just created. I think I called it Dev Summit Test 2. So here's that resource group. And here's the deployment. It's going to start off, and then in the space of 30 minutes, since this was GIS server, it'll complete, and you'll have a functioning site. So this was an experience where I started off, I was entirely in the Azure portal, just used resources from GitHub, didn't even need Cloud Builder as well. So with that, just a quick housekeeping task. Ask that you take our survey. Let me know how I did. Was it fun enough? Was it too brief? Was it too detailed? We appreciate all your feedback. And with that, I'll open up for questions.
So when you start tinkering with things with the
ARM
ARM
template?
Yeah, so once you do that, when it comes around to the upgrade, you basically break the ability to upgrade with 10.6.1.
Right. Okay, so good. The question was, I started off with Cloud Builder and then I started tweaking things outside of Cloud Builder. Will upgrades work? So I actually didn't have a chance to do a demo of upgrades, but upgrades also uses an ARM template where we don't actually change your resources. We actually just go into the VMs and install the new software and do all of the in-VM configuration. We do provision a single VM, which is the conduit for the new software, but essentially your infrastructure doesn't change. And another thing is, in addition to upgrading through Cloud Builder, you can actually, we actually generate automation artifacts, so you can actually even automate your upgrade. So to answer your question, if you make changes outside of Cloud Builder, they shouldn't be impacted, if you will. I mean, if you make heinous changes, that's a different story. Next question? Go ahead, sir. Right. So the question was, how far back will we support upgrades? So at this point, our minimum ship is, we're going to say 10.6 and beyond. But as you know, if you've followed along with our PowerShell DSA automation, we support prior versions. There's actually a little bit of work because we had a breaking change at 10.6 for the context URL. So if we did need to support prior versions, there's some work we need to do. So depending on whether that makes it for 10.6.1 or not, it depends. At this point, I'm saying 10.6 is the minimum ship, but we'll see how far we can get with prior versions. More questions? So just a general quick show of hands. Does the strategy seem okay in terms of who would want to use Cloud Builder versus the developer audience who wants to use automation and all of the tooling experience? Does the story sound simple enough, or is it too many options? Was good? Thumbs up? Right.
Cloud Builder scripts?
Yes.
Are they available now or gonna?
So Cloud Builder has been available publicly. The ARM templates, we will make them public shortly. So, I mean, it's essentially, we already bundle those templates as part of Cloud Builder. It's just a matter of uploading them to GitHub and making sure, we have the right documentation links and getting started things. But yeah, if you're interested in starting with it right away, send me a note and we can share that privately with you. Anything else? All right. Thank you.